Got to be diplomatic today.
Manitoba's Gary Doer is going to Washington. He says Canadians expect their leaders to put aside partisan differences when it comes to matters of national interest. And that's why he was pleased to accept the offer to be the next Canadian ambassador to the U.S. So will this appointment be a good thing for Canada-U.S. relations? And just how good a fit is Gary Doer? Joining us to talk about all of that now is Chris Sands. He's with the Hudson Institute, a think tank and public policy research organization in Washington, and he's an expert in U.S.-Canada relations. So first of all, Chris, what does Gary Doer have to do to become a successful ambassador and make his mark in Washington?
Well, I think that he starts with something very important, which is that he is a man of the center-left, someone who is very much attuned to the kind of debates we're having in Washington now, the kind of what the Obama administration has brought in, but also what the Congress is thinking. And I think what Stephen Harper will get from someone like Gary Doer is a very well-tuned ear that can communicate back to Harper and the Harper government what's really happening down here. So job number one is giving an accurate read of a very complex political situation in Washington back to Ottawa. And then maybe job two is being able to stand up and defend Canadian health care, explain Canadian concerns about Buy American provisions in the stimulus legislation and other things with some real credibility with the people who are in charge here in D.C. right now. People who will have a lot of respect for a low-key Midwesterner with a sense of humor who is articulate on the issues, but also somebody who is really somebody they'll be comfortable with from the beginning.
So they'll probably be comfortable with, but do you have any tips for Gary Doer? I don't think he probably needs many tips on how to make friends, but on the best way for him to make friends in the U.S.?
Well, I can say that just in the last several years, he's been a fairly regular visitor, whether it was on behalf of fellow premiers, as one of the more senior premiers in the current batch, or as someone coming down just from Manitoba. He's made a habit of coming to Washington, speaking to groups, big trade groups like the Canada-U.S. Business Council, Canadian-American Business Council, to some of the others here in town that are not as Canada-focused, trade associations on things like Canadian beef or softwood lumber. And also on energy issues, he has a very good way of talking about climate change, about hydroelectricity. What we hear about Canada all the time is about the oil sands in the West, and they're important, but Canada has so much else that it sells, and actually does have people like Gary Doer who really are concerned with the climate change problems, and he's very good on those. So I think that he'll be bringing a lot of very welcome messages here, and what he needs to do is just keep it up, because he's done a great job so far. A lot of people here know him and respect him.
The outgoing ambassador, Michael Wilson, was appointed during the Bush administration. Do you think that Gary Doer is a better fit in this Obama era? You mentioned the fact that he is center-left, perhaps more in line with Obama's Democrats, although some would say that the conservatives here and the Democrats in the states are about the same. But do you think in terms of personality he's a better fit with the Obama administration?
I do, and I have nothing but respect for Michael Wilson, and I think when Harper came in, he wanted to show that he took Canada-U.S. relations seriously, and that he, although a relatively young prime minister, was going to put a steady hand as his sort of front man for the U.S. relationship. Very appropriate, too, for the Bush family, for George Bush Sr. and George W. Bush, who really respected establishment figures, as Michael Wilson is very much. So it sent a message of sobriety, which was the right message for Harper to send when he came in. But since Obama's come in, Wilson has done a fabulous job. He's been very solid. But I think Doer offers the opportunity to bring a fresh message. We're in tune with the change. Remember that Obama and Harper are now times. We have another bilateral meeting coming up in a couple of weeks, and then the G20 summit in Pittsburgh a couple of weeks after that. So the two, Stephen Harper and Barack Obama, have shown that they can work together. They like each other. They have a good rapport. And now we're following up with an ambassador who I think will be able to carry that spirit forward, and will be somebody that around Washington people will feel comfortable talking to.
Just how significant is it that Stephen Harper has crossed party lines and appointed an NDP premier to this position? Because Stephen Harper, to a lot of people, I mean, he wouldn't be the first prime minister, but politics up here can get pretty partisan. Does this show that the prime minister is basically saying the relationship between Canada and the U.S. is so important that we have to go beyond all of that?
I think so, and I think it's a message in two directions. First, it's a message for the United States. One of the things Canada has to do all the time down here in Washington is communicate with the Congress. We're in a particularly partisan moment here in Washington. Democrats don't trust Republicans and vice versa. The language is very heated. And so to send a signal that although Stephen Harper is a conservative, that he intends to keep good Canada-U.S. relations and he's not going to be partisan about it, is the kind of message that needs to be heard on Capitol Hill in the Senate and the House. I think the Obama administration appreciates it. They're the executive branch, but the legislative branch is where it needs to be heard. So this is a very important signal. The other signal, of course, is to Canadians. With a potential election in the fall, Stephen Harper needs to show that he can manage the Canada-U.S. relationship steadily, and he's not putting an ideological agenda forward. I think having a good rapport with Barack Obama was part of that, but having a solid ambassador and showing that it's about competence for him, not about party label, that's exactly the kind of signal that he wants to send to Canadians so that they feel he could continue as Prime Minister perhaps after another election.
And Chris, just on a slightly lighter note, we know that if we think back to the 1980s when Brian Mulroney was Prime Minister, that Alan Gottlieb was the ambassador, and Sandra and Alan Gottlieb were known to have some pretty good parties, that the Canadian Embassy was sort of the place to be, not just to talk about Canada-U.S. relations. But how important is that, and can you see someone like Gary Doer reclaiming that title, if you will?
Well, I don't know. I think maybe in a different way. We saw this a bit with Murray Smith, who was Alberta's representative in town. Sometimes somebody who's as comfortable at a barbecue as he is at a state dinner can make a different kind of social splash. So I don't see Gary Doer necessarily as being a high society person, but being the kind of person that's comfortable meeting with the Obamas or meeting with any of Washington's power brokers in a much more low-key way, which I think is very helpful. Although, if the new ambassador wants to have parties, since I live here, I'm available. I come anytime. Free beer, always welcome.
All right, Chris. We'll take note. We'll send a message along for you. Thanks very much.
All right. Thank you, Andrew.
The bank says you're